Yes, my name is indeed Greenleaf-Perez, and I have indeed led worship across a wide range of denominational contexts. I started leading worship when I was 14 years old. I grew up in an AG, Assemblies of God church, so Pentecostal church, and they were pretty charismatic. So I got really good at flying by the seat of my pants leading worship, and did long worship services sometimes for like an hour, 2 hours, sometimes three. I think was four was the longest we ever did, playing bass till my fingers got raw, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I really enjoyed leading worship, and I've led worship on I guess, a professional or like paid level for basically all my adult life at several different churches, everything from Presbyterian churches to Pentecostal churches to interdenominational churches to Baptist churches to Bible churches to now I'm lead pastoring at a Foursquare church called Red Hills. And I think because of that, Ashley thought that I would be well suited for this workshop because I've seen both sides of the equation of how to be a worship leader that's working with a senior pastor, and then also now being a senior pastor that's working alongside a worship leader. The name of this workshop I went back and forth on. I think it's had three different names. One was how to lead alongside your lead pastor well, which is I think technically what this is called. The one that went on the Instagram post was why your lead pastor is not the enemy of creativity, which I think that might have been the one that I named and I forgot about it. And then the one I kind of landed on as I was finishing up my notes this week was building collaborative partnerships, because really this is what we're talking about. Collaborative partnerships, both in the way that you lead up and the way that you lead down, for lack of better terms. Creating collaboration between everybody. I think sometimes when it comes to creative endeavors, artists, we put our heart and soul into our art, right? And so sometimes it can get really personal and it feels like we have a vision of how we want things to go. And when it's not feeling like that's a shared vision, it can feel like we're bumping heads, right? And so sometimes it can feel like a tug of war over like what we want to happen in the space. Like the worship pastor really values this and really wants this, but the lead pastor really wants this and really values this. And that can happen between the lead pastor and the worship pastor. That can happen between the worship pastor and the sound tech. I've seen those dynamics at play where it's like the tech crew starts becoming like a nemesis of the creative crew, and they start like, being snippy with each other and all that kind of stuff. And what's important is to realize like we are all there for the same reason. We have to remember the why of why we're there, and we have to stop tugging for creative control and start rowing towards the same thing. So this is kind of the cheesy analogy that I think it stuck out in my mind, is we want to move from a tug of war dynamic to a rowing the boat dynamic. And the way that we do that is if we remember the why. Remember the why that you're there. We are there to do something beyond ourselves. When we get together and we play music and we teach the word and we invite people in and we make coffee, when we do the Sunday morning thing or we do the Wednesday night thing, we are doing something that is beyond the sum of its parts. When you put it on paper, nothing that we do there is impressive in any way, really. It's all stuff that anybody could do. But because the Holy Spirit is the one empowering what we do, there's something that takes place in that environment that is beyond what we could do without Him. So we have to remember that we're there to bless the name of Jesus, to give up an offering of praise, that we're there to embrace and engage with the presence of the Holy Spirit, and we're inviting people into a place of transformation and devotion and consecration to God. That's what we're there to do. And if that's the shared goal, if we can get on board with that, then it becomes easier to stop feeling like a tug of war. So the first thing first point that I want to make in terms of how we start building collaborative partnership is first examine yourself. I think there's something about an artist that most of us are critics. Most of us have a cynical side. And I think cynicism is actually really important, especially in faith. But here's how I say it. It's good to let cynicism have a seat at your table, but don't let it run the meeting. Cynicism cannot be the overriding voice of how you operate in the church. I've seen that happen where if there's bitterness, if there feels like there's a controlling environment, if it feels like there's a clash of values, cynicism becomes kind of our weapon that we send out in front of us to do business for us so that we can survive in that space. And that's how we get toxic leadership. That's how we get unhealthy, toxic dynamics in teams. So welcome your cynicism. It has its place. Even Tim this morning was saying deconstruction is important. Reconstruction is equally important, because if we deconstruct everything away, we have no solutions. That's what cynics do. They just talk about why everything doesn't work, but they don't bring any solutions. They don't bring any creative solutions to the table. So check your cynicism. You're going to examine yourself first. Rather than pointing the finger at like, well, the lead pastor doesn't value this and my church doesn't value that and the people just stand there like sticks and nobody cares. And like, I've been in places of worship where I feel that way, where I'm leading worship and I'm just like, none of you get it. None of you know why we're here and I'm done with you. Like I've felt that in my soul before. And that's not a healthy place to lead from. That anger has its place, but it can't run your soul. It can't run the show. So we're going to start with examining the self. Don't blame everything on the other person. In any kind of relationship that's struggling, for example, rarely is it ever like a wholesale, it's one person's fault. That dynamic just like rarely happens. They're doing some exciting stuff over there. That dynamic rarely happens, right? Like even if 90% of the problem is them, like they're super emotionally immature and controlling or whatever, and they have toxic behavior, blah, blah, blah. Even if 90% of it is them, there's usually still like a 10% part of the equation that I have to own myself. So you have to own your piece of the pie, and it might be a lot more than 10% when you really start to bring yourself to Jesus and say, hey, what's going on in my heart and mind are the things that I need to check at the door. You might find that a bigger part of the problem is you than you wanted to admit. And so examine yourself first. There's a framework, a leadership framework that came from a guy named Scott Linklater that I use a lot, and it's called the drama triangle. Basically, whenever there's conflict or drama, we tend to act like the left-hand side over here. We either want to play the victim or become the hero, and we want to make the other person the villain, right? So the other person on the other side of the equation, they're the bad guy. And when I can call someone and label them a bad guy or a villain, I'm kind of justified in feeling and behaving the way that I want to feel and behave because my cause is just, right? But the problem is no work gets done there. That just creates division. It moves me away from the other person. And so instead of creating drama where I want to play the victim or I need a hero to come and save me and I go to complain to somebody because they're going to listen to me and they're going to take care of the bad guy, instead we want to focus on the why, the work. What are we here to do? Me making you a bad guy or someone that's in the way of my creativity is not going to help. We have to remember that we're there for the same thing, for the embrace and the praise and the transformational power of the presence of God. That's why we're here. But if we make anything that we do about the drama, then we're not going to be able to move towards the work. And so don't become a victim, don't become a hero, don't become a villain. Move towards the work. Don't make them the villain. Move towards the work. And part of learning how to do this well is paying attention to your own emotional health. Emotionally unhealthy leaders are insecure, they're territorial, and they're petty. And so, and creativity matched with all those things is a recipe for disaster. Artists are often really moody and often have a lot to say and all the things, and those things are important. But if it's not checked with emotional maturity and emotional health, it can be really toxic to an environment. And so we don't want to be insecure. We don't want to be anxious. We don't want to be self-absorbed. We don't want to be controlling. So my advice would be kill your ego. Kill your ego. I'm going to give you an example of how this works, how this has worked in my life. It's not a worship leading example, but I think it applies. Preaching is an art form too. I could sit up there and I could read a commentary to the congregation, but that's not the same as crafting a sermon. There's art in what I do, the rhythm in which I bring up different points, the way in which I make people laugh and then bring them down and relieve the pressure again. Like there's an art form in crafting a message for the congregation. And when I preach a message, it's often out of the deepest convictions of my soul, right? And so when I'm bringing that to God and I'm bringing that to the congregation, it's a really vulnerable thing to do. And when I first started preaching at a really large church in Beaverton, I was preaching in front of a service of 1,200 people 3 times a day or 3 times in a Sunday. And it was really intimidating. So I poured a lot of heart and soul into those messages. And there was a pastor there named Steve Mitchell, who was 10 times smarter than me, 10 times wiser than me, 10 times better than me in every way. And I looked up to him a lot. And he would take my sermons and he would just go through them and he would tell me, Lane, that interpretive angle is off. That biblical context didn't exist. You're off base there. this isn't going to work, that's not going to land. You haven't thought through how that's going to affect people. He would give me compliments too. But I'm just saying, when I was reading it as a young communicator, I only heard all that like criticism. And it was really hard for me to like sit there and let someone tear my heart and soul to pieces, right? Because it was mine. It's my sermon, my thing. But then it was like the Holy Spirit flipped a switch in me. And I realized, wait a minute, no, this sermon isn't mine. This is an offering. This is something that I'm giving of myself to God's people from God. God's using me to give God's people something. It's not actually mine. I'm the catalyst. I'm the host of this gift. And if I want it to serve the church, if my aim is that people would be served and that they become more into Christ likeness, why should I feel territorial about that? Why should I be afraid of feedback? Because any feedback that I get from someone I respect and love so much is bound to be good feedback that's going to make this thing better. So I started detaching my art from me. I started detaching my art from the artist, which I know some of you might look at that and go, no, but your art is you. And I agree. But when we're using it to serve the church, we can't identify with it in the same way because it's not there to, my art in the church is not there for Lane to be expressed. My art in the church is there to bring people into Christ likeness and discipleship. So I have to think about it and I have to approach it differently. And there's not necessarily clean lines of delineation there. There's gray space, but the heart of what I'm saying I think holds true. You have to be willing to allow your art and your creativity to come under scrutiny if you really care about what you're there to do. And you can't do that without emotional health. And so a couple of resources I think are helpful are Pete Scazzero and Rich Villodas. They both do a lot of work with this kind of stuff. The Emotionally Healthy Leader and The Deeply Formed Life. They actually, Rich Villodas took over for Pete Scazzero's church. And so if you read one, you kind of hear the other. But Pete Scazzero tends to focus more on this emotional health thing. Next point, building trust. Building a collaborative, a good collaborative partnership with your lead pastor, with your worship pastor, is going to be about building trust. If you can't build trust with them, everything's going to feel like you're going uphill. Everything's going to feel like you're going against the grain because I don't know what your heart is. I don't know what you're aiming to do. I don't know if you're going to derail what I'm trying to do. And so if I don't have trust, that drama triangle is going to look really attractive. I'm going to fill that gap with all kinds of negative assumptions about you. And I don't think Christ wants that for his ministry partners. And so first thing to building trust is get to know your leader. Get to know your leader. What kind of people are involved in this relationship? Because who your leader is going to greatly define how you minister alongside them. And every time you go to a new lead pastor or a new context, you'll have to start from scratch. Because no lead pastor is the same, no worship pastor is the same, and how you partner with them is going to be a different chemistry every single time. Are they a laid-back leader who's more like, yeah, I relinquish creative control and kind of whatever you want to do is fine? Or are they more like micromanaging? Like, actually, when you sang this part of the verse, like, I was a worship pastor before I became a lead pastor. And so I had to really discipline myself not to be a micromanager because I had a lot to say about how to craft a set and how to lead worship and how to lead a congregation. And I really wanted Ashley, and if you're listening to this, Ashley, because you're editing, I don't know if I've told you this in person, but I really wanted Ashley to feel like she had agency to be the worship pastor for our church without me dictating how that needed to be. Now, we, after time and built more trust between each other, I'm now in a place where I can more readily give her feedback and tell her like, hey, when I would lead worship, maybe I'd do it a little differently in this way or whatever. And that's not like the lay of the law, like I want it this way, therefore you'll do it this way. But there's room for me now to speak into how she leads and how she does things. But I had to build trust first. Is the leader that you're with performance oriented, right? Are they really into kind of the production value? And if you're a worship leader that's not into like the smoke machines and the lights, and that person that you're leading for is, then there's going to be a constant kind of butting up of values that's going to make that difficult. You have to know that. You have to know what that person is looking for. What were the expectations of the worship leader in the last context, right? So if you're coming onto the scene and they had a worship leader before for any amount of time, your pastor, your leader got used to leading alongside that person. And so if I were you, I would take your lead pastor out to lunch and I would say, hey, I want to get to know you. I want to know what your values are. Tell me, what was your last worship pastor like? What were things that you guys did really well together? What was something that you didn't do really well together? Um, and then active listening in those conversations are really important. Don't just project those questions in order to act like you care. Actually care about what they're saying, because God has placed that leader in your life and in that context in that church for a reason. And they place you in that context and in their life and in that church for a reason. And so really pay attention to what's going on. And in that active listening, try to establish values. Establish values. They say in a marriage, around money, for example, money is a representation of what you value. And when it comes to money, there actually isn't a right or wrong thing to value. There's just different values. Some people might value certain experiences. Some people might value security for the future. Those things aren't better or worse, but they are different. And if you don't understand and have empathy for your partner's values, it's always going to feel like you're doing that tug of war thing. It's not going to feel like you're rowing. It's going to feel like I want my thing and you want your thing, and we're in the way of each other. But if you can learn how to value what they value and vice versa, then you can start moving towards a shared goal together. So what are their expectations going into a worship service? Like or a worship gathering, what do you think this is when we get together? When they walk out of the room, what are you hoping that congregant experienced when they were in the body of believers? What is the thing that you want? Ask them those kinds of questions. And as you begin to understand what their expectations are and what their leadership is moving people towards, then as you structure your leadership and your dynamics and your music and your teams, you can decide whether or not you want to be alongside that goal or if that's not a good context for you. How do you want the service to feel? What do you want people to be doing in worship? Establish the values and learn how to value what they value. Because chances are you're not a fully, wholly, complete leader all on your own. You probably need to be rounded out by the people around you. And it could be that your lead pastor or your worship pastor has certain values or areas of focus that are a blind spot to you. And if you can learn to value what they value, again, you move towards that rowing relationship and not a tug of war relationship. Next is set clear expectations. Critique is always really hard when there wasn't an expectation in the first place, right? So if you're at the, in a service review meeting or something, or a gathering review meeting, and you're like, I was really disappointed that this didn't happen. Okay, well, I didn't, if I'm on the other side of that, I didn't know that you wanted that to happen. That wasn't an expectation that you gave me. And so it's not fair to critique somebody on performance based on an expectation that was never present. And so if there are things that you really value, if there are things that they really value, make sure you know what those things are and make sure that the expectations are clear. Also make sure that you're getting the expectations from the person. If there's not clarity coming from your leader, get the clarity, because they might assume that you think that. They might have an assumption like, oh, well, I don't have to communicate that to my worship leader because they probably already know, and they might be wrong about that, right? And it's not that they're trying to keep things from you necessarily, but if you don't have clarity around how long the worship set is supposed to be, or like whether or not they're comfortable with charismatic expressions in a worship service, or if they're okay with like going with the flow and moving from the structure, or et cetera, et cetera. If you don't have those expectations, it's going to be really hard to have quote unquote success, or what would be like a green light for a partnership together. So give clear expectations and then get clear expectations and then plan ahead. If you're wanting to do something creatively or experimentally that you know is going to be outside of the box, or you know is going to push people or whatever, make sure that your lead pastor has a heads up about that or what you're planning to do. Or if you're doing an element of the service that's unique that you don't normally incorporate, make sure that your lead pastor has eyes on it, that your lead pastor understands what the vision is, because sometimes it's really hard for a lead pastor to understand what you're going for until they see it, right? And so if they need to see it, try to visualize that the best way that you can. For example, when I was at my last church, we had an idea for setting up the room in a really unique way. And it was kind of hard to describe. And so our one of our worship leaders ended up drawing out like schematics of the entire sanctuary or gathering hall or auditorium, whatever you want to call it. Ended up making a whole schematic of that space and like drawing out and even creating 3D like images of like, here's what this will look like when this is moved here. So that the lead pastor could get like an understanding of what it was going to be. If there's going to be a video element, one time, by the way, when you plan ahead, this also helps you to avoid last minute changes, which are frustrating for everybody. But like I was at a church once where there was a big performance video that went behind one of the special songs. And it was this gorgeous, like sweeping cinematography of like the Pacific Northwest. And it was just really beautiful. They went and got all the footage themselves. There was no like stock footage. They went and recorded it all. It was this masterpiece of like a 7-minute movie. And then the lead pastor, during the debrief meeting after the first Christmas Eve, it was Christmas Eve, after the first Christmas Eve service, we had 5 of them that year, 6 of them, 5 of them. He said, yeah, it's really great. I really want lyrics on it. And he didn't understand that like adding lyrics to this video in time with the song was like gonna be a whole thing. Like it's not just gonna be like, oh yeah, just plug and play some lyrics. Like you had to design that into each of the you guys know. It was gonna be a whole thing. Maybe AI can do that now. But back then, it was like you had to manually do that every lyric, every step of the way. And she was basically up all night making sure that she could make the changes for that video for the next Christmas Eve service. That's super frustrating. Creatives hate that. And so if you can plan ahead and like plan to finish the video 2 weeks ahead of time, so that when the pastor sees the video, he's like, you know what, this is really cool. What I'd like though, I think are lyrics, because I want my value is that the people in the pews are not just listening to something beautiful, but that they're being moved by the wonderful lyrics of this song. There's way less tension there. There's way less last minute apprehension there. It's more about like, what are we aiming to accomplish to do and how can we best refine what we're doing to get us there? So plan ahead, plan ahead. This one was more for lead pastors than it was for worship leaders, but it could also be for lead pastors, is speak from your area of knowledge. It always used to bother me as a worship leader when someone who wasn't a musician or wasn't familiar with that kind of ministry would give advice that like clearly it didn't make sense. Where it was like, I know what you're trying to explain, but that's not what's going on here. For example, there was a time where our lead pastor he came in early to one of our meetings where we were going through click tracks. So we were listening to the click tracks and seeing how the arrangement was going to work. And he was like, wait, you don't hear that in your ears when you're playing, do you? And we were like, no, actually we do. Like that helps keeps us on beat, keeps the arrangement together. He's like, no. You don't have a metronome playing in your ears while you're leading music, do you? And we're like, no, actually we do. Like it's really helpful, especially if we have a video element or something that has to be in sync. Like there's certain reasons. And he's just like, I just can't imagine how you can follow the leading of the Spirit when you have a metronome in your ear. I can't fathom it. And so he almost had this like existential crisis about how we were like locked in like robots to this, arrangement or whatever. And to some degree, like he had a point, but also he did not understand the full scope of like what an MD does and how they can change the click track even on the fly and how we can, turn the click track off if we feel like we need to linger in a chorus or what. He didn't understand those dynamics. And so he was speaking advice from an area of knowledge that he didn't have. And so that was going to be more for my lead pastors, like, hey, listen, trust your creatives a little bit. And if you feel like something's off, don't try to pretend like you understand something that you don't. Allow your creative to have the expertise that they have. And I'm sure that the dynamic works the other way around, but I didn't really have time to think through what that might have looked like. So building trust. This creates room for creative freedom. It creates joy in your work, which is so important for creatives to actually enjoy what you do. And it's actually more effective. It makes what we do work towards what we're all working for, is for all people to join in worship with the Creator. So that's what building trust does. That's how we build collaborative relationships. Those are just some things that I thought were principles that could work with any relationship, lead pastor to worship pastor. But again, I think that everyone's dynamic is going to be specific. And so if we can go to questions now. Did everyone scan the QR code? Everyone scan it? Great. We'll just take 2 minutes. Why don't you think through questions that you want to ask? Submit at least one question so that we can jump into that together. We've got a few questions to start with here. I'll start with the one that's submitted first. We got about 20 minutes, so we'll dive in. how much should evangelism be a part of the Sunday morning service? That's such an interesting question. I don't have like a firm enough thought out philosophy around this, but I'll tell you kind of what my instincts and my gut tell me. The gathering of Christians on a Sunday morning, especially when it comes to our sacraments, our worship, our liturgies, those are primarily intended for followers of Jesus to worship and glorify Jesus. That's what they're primarily there to do. Now, that in and of itself is a witness to the world. I am of the opinion that there's probably not any amount of musicianship or art in the church that's going to wow people into following Jesus. Like, I'd like to say, like, no, you can craft a song that's going to completely move someone and change someone, and they're going to make a commitment because of the excellence of the art. And I think that there's room for a partnership with the Holy Spirit in that. But what is going to be a witness to the world is not going to be how good we are at putting on a show or putting on a performance. It's going to be our devotion to Christ. That's the ultimate witness. And so this is just one man's opinion, but in my opinion, if you're crafting your art and your liturgy in a church service to be appealing to someone who doesn't know Jesus, you end up not hitting either target really well. And so I think primarily we're there to facilitate the worship of God's people to God. And it's our devotion to God, which is a witness to the world around us. And so it's not like we don't want people who are coming to church, we want them to feel uncomfortable or want them to feel like outsiders. But in some ways, what we're doing is kind of an insider thing. When we take communion, that is something that is reserved for those who have committed their lives to following Jesus. Like, that is in nature sort of an exclusionary act that has an open invitation. And like, you're welcome to come to the table and to sit and to be with us and to experience the life of our community. But we take this sacrament as something that only followers of Jesus do. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, it doesn't really make sense for you to take communion. In the same way, I wouldn't expect somebody who doesn't love Jesus to lift their hands in worship to the Creator unless they've been moved by what Jesus has done for them in their life. And so, again, this is like sort of unprocessed thought, but I think the seeker-friendly movement, right, that kind of happened in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, it was like, how do we make church appealing to people that don't go to church? And I think that question's important, but I think that question isn't actually about style most of the time. I think that question is more about substance. Is the substance of your community appealing to the non-Christian? Because what we do in terms of our liturgy and our art is gonna feel alien in some ways, I think, to most non-Christians. And so there's a tension to be managed in what I'm saying, and I accept that. But I don't primarily see worship music as an evangelistic tool, if that makes sense. Cool, ruffled enough feathers there. That's great. We have 8 questions. Hopefully we get time for all this. How do you set healthy expectations with the lead pastor as a worship leader? How do you set healthy expectations? I don't know if there's a one-size-fits-all answer to your question, but I do think that you, as the worship leader, you have a dual responsibility, right? A responsibility to help carry out the vision of your leader, but also to care for the team that's been entrusted to you. And so it's a difficult tension. I do think having an honest conversation is a great way to go, where it's just like, hey, this is an expectation that I can tell that you have and that you value. Can I tell you what I'm bumping up against and why? Let me bring you into my world and explain why this is difficult to accomplish. Because sometimes I think what can happen is like, why can't you just do this? Or like, what's the big deal of like adding this thing? Why can't you do that? I see lots of other worship pastors do that. And taking time to explain your context, like, hey, listen, we're not like a 3,000 person mega church with like 40, musicians that are like studio level, right? Like asking Barbara, who teaches classical piano during the week, to like try this new thing or this patch, like we can get there, but like it takes a lot of time to like bring her up to speed on this type of thing. And so I would say open communication is a good starting point, but I don't know if that's like a solution. It's just a good starting point. Is there a way to continue the atmosphere of worship even through announcements into the sermon? Oh, good God. Yeah. It says, is there a way to continue the atmosphere of worship even through the announcements into the sermon? Oh, wow. Thanks, love. I wrestle with it all the time, and the announcements are every church I've ever been a part of, every service curating team I've ever been a part of, this has been the bane of our existence every single time. So I want to say every church in every context wrestles with this question every single time. We are, so actually, I don't know if I told you this, Jay, but we are planning a meeting, me, Ashley, and a few other people in the church. We're planning a meeting to kind of put everything on the table and to say, like, if we were going to start a worship service from scratch on Sunday and there were no rules or expectations for how it needed to go, what would we do and why? And so we're kind of taking a moment to reset and refocus on, like, what do we even value in a worship space and how do we want to accomplish that? And so this question is in process for me because I've been struggling with it for a long time. I saw one church do announcements at the end, which is really interesting because, and our church is unique because we're always crunched for time because we're doing 3 services back to back. And so it's really hard to make everything fit and make it flow. But I saw someone do it at the end of the service and they kind of tied it into the application of the sermon. So it was like, worship flowed right into sermon time, which is actually always my favorite thing to do. I love to connect those moments. But also, if you put announcements at the beginning or the end, you just lose out on people knowing what's going on because they're not paying attention, right? And so anyway, so I don't know how to answer that question, but I know there's lots of ways you could do it. Yeah, Chris. Yeah, it does feel unnatural. Yeah. Especially if you think of, like, church history through most of time, announcements probably weren't really a thing, It's like, yeah, doing it on our scale and our level of activity, it is unique. So you got me thinking, Chris, and during that meeting, I'll probably bring that up. Great. Thank you, love of my life, for that question. Is making space, oh, wait. Oh, the question switched order. That's interesting. Is making space for the Holy Spirit for spontaneous worship an expectation for lead pastors? Is it an expectation for I think for some, for sure. There's so much that goes into that question, right? Depending on denomination, depending on theology, depending on value statements. Again, it could be a value statement. At our church, for example, there's like, I highly value it when there's spontaneous space in worship. We also have a very interdenominational context at our church where, like, sometimes the people that are in the pews are coming from, like, Lutheran backgrounds and Anglican backgrounds, and we're like, sing your own song to God. They're like, what are you talking about? So, like, that can be really, like, jarring for some. And also we have these really tight 70-minute services where it's like we kind of need things to run like a well-oiled machine to get through everything, which I lament on a regular basis, but it is kind of a thing. So there's a lot of factors going into that. And if you find that there's resistance, like, I'm leading worship and I want to move into spontaneous space and it feels like I'm always just being rushed, maybe take some time to, like, have an honest conversation and build some trust with your leader. Like, hey, I've noticed this dynamic, and, like, this is something that I value, something that I shoot for sometimes when I'm leading worship, and I notice some resistance to that. I trust your leadership, and I know that everything you do for, like, intentional reasons. Can you walk me through, like, why this feels like a tension point for us? I guarantee you there are very few pastors, unless they're really toxic and unhealthy, that will hear a question like that in the heart of real humility like that and get frustrated because they want to be able to communicate why they value what they value. So I think it is an expectation for some lead pastors and not for others, and that's kind of, you have to get to know your leader. If you disagree on a style of leadership in worship, who gets the final answer, pastor or worship leader? The real curt and not diplomatic answer to this is, I think it has to be your lead pastor. They have a weight on their shoulders, and I'm just now starting to understand this as a lead pastor. I'm doing this for 3 years. I was a worship pastor my whole adult life and then became a lead pastor. And again, there was this part of me that would tend to see my lead pastor as like an enemy of, like, our creativity or, like, what the Spirit of God's trying to do in the room. And oftentimes that frustration came out of not totally understanding the weight that the lead pastor had to carry. for what was happening in that service, of dynamics that I don't even know about because they're happening in email chains and in private conversations that I'll never be privy to, right? And so I'm learning that when the lead pastor makes a decision, if it's in a good and healthy state of spirit and mind, there's a good reason for it. And you have to trust that sometimes he can't or she can't disclose all of the information all of the time. And so, there could also just be this thing where there's a style difference and there's not going to be a place where you can meet in the middle. And that's really frustrating. That depends a lot on you. Like, how much are you committed to the way that you lead worship and feel like you can be authentic in your leadership and operate under this framework of lead pastor? That's why I tell worship leaders sometimes, I'm like, don't just apply and say yes to any worship gig anywhere. Like, know the culture of the church that you're saying yes to, because if you're not able to really connect with that culture, then you're going to be super frustrated all the time. I feel like you're running uphill. I applied to so many churches when I first moved to Portland, and I ended up applying for this job. Apparently, he was a very prevalent pastor in the Portland area. I had never heard of him, but I was one of 18 different applicants for this worship pastor job. And I got to the final round, which was between two of us out of 18 worship pastors, and I was like 25 years old. And they basically told me that they didn't want me, the elders didn't want me on the church because they were afraid, because I came from an AG background, Assemblies of God background, that I was going to start making their congregants speak in tongues from behind my guitar. And I was just like, listen, I'm not like a narcissistic punk that's just gonna like steamroll or whatever over whatever like the lead pastor wants me to do. Like, if you guys don't want me to speak in tongues, I'm not gonna speak in tongues. I wouldn't probably do that anyway from the microphone, but like that just wasn't. It was a dynamic where they were really concerned about it. And at the end of the day, it was probably a good thing that we didn't end up partnering together, because I'm not like on the far end of charismatic expression, like kind of a, rolling in the aisles kind of thing. But I do like some freedom. And if I felt that straitjacket on me all the time, like I had to hide my Pentecostal theology around these people, like that was not going to be a good partnership. And so I'm actually glad that God kind of cut me at that last stage, because that probably would have been a really frustrating partnership. And so be thoughtful about that as you enter into relationships. What would be red flags in terms of establishing values with your lead pastor, and how could you navigate larger value differences? Red flags. If there's a low value on caring for people at the expense of the product, that's a red flag for me. If you're communicating to your lead pastor like, hey, listen, we can make this many services work or make this thing work, but I'm worried about burnout for my volunteers, I'm worried about this. If there's a lot of hyper spiritual language where it's like, well, you got to submit your life at the altar of God, and like, they use the Bible to justify like you getting burnout, I would call that a red flag. Always, always, always value the people under your care more than the product. 10 times out of 10, value the person and not the product. I would rather have an awkward transition on a Sunday morning than humiliate or burn out like people on my team. It's not that important to be that polished. It's just not. So I think that's a red flag. I think that has to come down to you, because what's a red flag to you is not necessarily going to be a red flag to everybody. There are certain ubiquitous principles, like, if they're a narcissistic leader that's like really just concerned with their image and like how many books they can sell or whatever, and like there are certain things that's going to be a problem no matter where you're at. But what it could be a red flag to you is like, the person says like, yeah, I really think that we need to only be singing hymns from the traditional church because it's that kind of rich theology that's the foundation of our, of our doctrine and how we do things. And so like, I really don't want to be doing Hillsong or Bethel or any songs that you write. I want it to be like old dead people that have written all of our songs. That would be a red flag for me. If I were the worship leader, because I love hymns and I love the traditional church, but I also believe that creativity is an ongoing thing empowered by the Spirit. So for me, that would be a red flag. But there'd be some worship leaders out there that maybe that's actually their bread and butter. They're like, yeah, I lead from the organ, and that's like what I want to do, and I use the hymnal, and that's it. So like, what'll be a red flag for you is not necessarily a red flag for everybody else. Again, identifying values is just really such an important dynamic that I can't understate or can't overstate. How do you know when a denominational difference is something that you can work through versus when it's just not right church for you? Yeah, I think I've talked about that a little bit. You know, yeah, there are certain denominational differences that are going to be a really big deal. And I think um, core doctrine is a good place to start. For example, if they really don't think women should speak in church, and you're a female worship leader that likes to speak in between songs, like that's going to be really tough for you to like serve in that environment. If they don't believe in the continuing work of the Holy Spirit, and you are someone who believes that the worship space is a place for things like that, and opportunity for divine healings and prophetic words, like that's going to be a tough thing for you to do. And so I would say define for yourself what are the non-negotiables. What are the things that like I draw a line in the sand and I can't really partner with people that don't work this way. Two more questions and 2 more minutes. If there are people in the congregation complaining about the voice of a worship leader, what should the worship pastor and or lead pastor do? How do address the congregation to stop this behavior? Oh, this is a deep question. Okay, one is there's not going to be any creative singer, artist, anything that's going to please everyone in the congregation. Like everyone's always going to have a difference of opinion. Nobody's for everybody. My preaching's not for everybody that goes to our church, but they're a part of our church for other reasons, right? Um, if it's a majority that go, yeah, this is like nails on a chalkboard, man, and like it's really distracting, then you maybe need to have some humility enough to think maybe I empowered someone too quickly, and like this is a repeated issue all the time. But if it's just one person that's just like, yeah, I don't really like their voice, and it's just all the time, it's like, well, you're not going to like everybody's voice, and like not everybody's going to be for you. Like you're not always going to like Bob Dylan and Shania Twain. I can't think of other singers. Whatever, Adele, right? Like there's just going to be stylistic differences that are hard. If it's a matter of skill, where it's just like they are not competent, then yeah, that's important. Giving people an opportunity to grow in their leadership on the stage is important, but like moderate how much. Like if there's someone who's like really growing in their competency and they're not quite there yet, don't let them lead an entire set by themselves. Let them lead like a verse, and then take over for them, and then let their influence start to grow on your team. Otherwise, though, I would say, and this dynamic is like, how do you get people, congregants, to stop the behavior, like critiquing people? It takes a lot of bravery, but don't just acquiesce to what they're doing. Like, don't just give in to their opinion and just be like, yeah, you're right. I know it's kind of annoying, huh? But like don't do that. And that's the same thing with like your lead pastor, where someone's like, hey, I really wish we did more of this at our church. You have the opportunity to say like, you know what, I wish we did too. Talk to the big guy or whatever. Or you could say, yeah, I can understand why you'd have that value, but here's some reasons why like I've gotten to know like what our leadership wants at our church and like why we've made certain decisions. It's honoring people that aren't there to defend themselves and like choosing not to gossip. So that's an important thing. Ooh, we're out of time. How does a band leader and worship singer together work together well, especially if the band spends time practicing together without the singers, and they still want to honor the singers and not just add them in as an afterthought? That sounds very specific. I think there is some merit to having singers and bands like rehearse separately and together, especially for singers. Like if we're doing an arrangement with the band and the singers need to work out harmonies, if the band needs to stop for 10 minutes so that the singers can work through like a vocal arrangement, that makes the efficacy of the practice difficult. So it really becomes about integrating the teams once they're together and making sure that there's an understood expectation and collaboration.